Picture this: a moonlit battlefield somewhere in an impossible world where east meets west. The mist rolls across ancient ground as two figures emerge from opposite ends of the field. One, clad in layered scales of iron and silk, moves with the fluid precision of flowing water. The other, encased in gleaming steel plates, advances with the unstoppable force of an avalanche. Tonight, we settle one of history's greatest debates. For centuries, warriors and historians have wondered if a medieval European knight faced a Japanese samurai in single combat, who would emerge victorious? It's a question that has sparked countless arguments in taverns, classrooms, and internet forums. Some swear by the knight's impenetrable armor and devastating charge. Others champion the samurai's lightning speed and razor-sharp blade. But what if I told you that the answer isn't as simple as picking a side? The truth is, this isn't just about comparing two warriors. It's about understanding two completely different philosophies of war, two distinct approaches to the art of killing, and two cultures that shape their fighters in radically different ways. By the time we're done here, you'll have a deeper understanding of medieval combat than most history professors. You'll know exactly how these legendary warriors trained, fought, and died. And yes, you'll finally have your answer about who would win. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. The outcome depends entirely on circumstances we haven't even discussed yet. The terrain, the weapons allowed, whether they're mounted or on foot, even the time period we're talking about. All of these factors could completely flip the result. We're not just looking at a simple matchup. We're analyzing a chess game played with steel and blood. Let me start with something that might surprise you. Most people think they understand what a medieval knight was, but they're dead wrong. Hollywood has filled our heads with images of clunky, slow-moving tin cans who could barely swing a sword. The reality? A properly trained knight in full plate armor was a precision killing machine, as agile as a dancer and as deadly as a hurricane. Take the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. French knights, supposedly the most elite warriors of their time, charged across a muddy field toward English positions. What happened next became legend. Thousands of arrows rained down like a steel storm. The English longbowmen, capable of firing 6 arrows per minute, turned the battlefield into a killing ground. Knights fell not because their armor failed, but because the sheer volume of projectiles found every gap, every weak point, every unprotected inch of flesh. But here's what most people miss about that battle. The knights who made it through that arrow storm, they carved through English infantry like wheat before a scythe. Their armor, weighing around 60 pounds but perfectly balanced, allowed them to fight for hours without exhaustion. A suit of plate armor wasn't just protection, it was nearly invulnerable to sword cuts. Even the legendary sharpness of a katana couldn't penetrate properly tempered steel plates. The knights' training began at 7 years old. These weren't weekend warriors or part-time soldiers. From childhood, they practiced with devices like the quintain, a rotating target that taught them to strike accurately while moving at full gallop. Miss the target, and a weight would swing around and knock them from their horse. It was brutal, repetitive training that created muscle memory so deep it became instinct. Their weapons told a story of raw, devastating power. The lance, when couched properly under the arm and braced against the breastplate, could punch through armor like a spear through paper. The momentum of horse and rider combined created a force that could shatter shield walls and break enemy formations in a single charge. After the lance inevitably broke, the knight switched to his sword, not the elegant rapier of later periods, but a brutal, heavy blade designed to crush bones even through armor. Now, let's cross the world to feudal Japan, where an entirely different warrior culture was taking shape. The samurai weren't just fighters, they were artists of war. Where knights relied on overwhelming force, samurai perfected the art of precision. Their approach to combat was almost surgical in its elegance. The katana represents everything the samurai stood for. Forged from tamahagane steel, through a process so complex it bordered on alchemy, these blades were folded and hammered repeatedly at precise temperatures. The result was a sword that balanced hardness with flexibility, creating a weapon that could slice through silk scarves and cleave through armor with equal ease. The visible hamon, or temper line, wasn't just decoration, it was proof of the sword's perfect construction. But the katana was more than a weapon. In samurai culture, the sword was considered part of the warrior's soul. This spiritual connection translated into a fighting philosophy that emphasized perfect technique over brute strength. A samurai didn't just swing his sword. He channeled years of training, meditation, and philosophical study into every cut. Their armor tells a different story entirely. Where knights encased themselves in steel fortresses, samurai wore what looked almost like elaborate artworks. The o-yoroi, worn by high-ranking samurai, used up to 300 meters of colorful silk cords called kumihimo to bind together thousands of individual scales. This wasn't vanity, it was psychology. Samurai understood that intimidation was a weapon as powerful as any blade. The scales themselves, made from leather and iron, provided excellent protection while remaining surprisingly lightweight. A samurai needed to be mobile, to move like water across the battlefield. They fought on horseback with bow and arrow, dismounted to engage with naginata polearms, and closed for the kill with their legendary swords. This versatility made them incredibly dangerous opponents. Training began even earlier for samurai, often around age 10, but their education went far beyond martial arts. They studied calligraphy, poetry, and Confucian ethics alongside kenjutsu swordsmanship and kyujutsu archery. Zen Buddhism taught them to control fear and maintain clarity in the chaos of battle. This mental discipline was their secret weapon. Consider the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where these principles played out on a massive scale. Samurai armies had evolved far beyond individual duels. They used complex formations like the hushi, or sharp arrow, where archers and early firearms thinned enemy ranks before infantry charged in flying wedge formations. When Shimazu Yoshihiro found himself outnumbered and surrounded, he used just 80 of his personal retainers to punch through enemy lines in a perfectly executed wedge charge. The tactical sophistication was staggering. Units called sonai, containing 300 to 800 men each, coordinated ranged weapons, polearms, support troops, and cavalry in seamless concert. This wasn't the chaotic melee that Hollywood depicts. It was warfare as art form. But here's where things get interesting. By the late Sengoku period, Japanese warfare had evolved to incorporate firearms on a massive scale. The Tanegashima matchlocks, improved and mass-produced by Japanese swordsmiths after Portuguese introduction in 1543, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Samurai adapted these weapons into their tactical doctrine so effectively that Japan became one of the most gun-heavy military powers in the world. This adaptability reveals something crucial about the samurai mindset. They weren't trapped by tradition. They were pragmatists who understood that victory required embracing new technologies and tactics. A samurai who refused to evolve was a dead samurai. So we have two warrior cultures, each representing a completely different approach to the art of war. Knights embodied the philosophy of the unstoppable force, relying on superior equipment, devastating charges, and sheer physical dominance. Samurai represented the principle of the perfectly placed cut, using speed, precision, and psychological warfare to defeat their enemies. The question isn't just who would win in a fight. The question is which philosophy of warfare proves superior when these two approaches collide. And that answer depends on variables we haven't even begun to explore. The battlefield conditions would determine everything. Picture our knight and samurai meeting on an open plain, both mounted on their war horses. The knight spurs his destrier forward, lance leveled, building momentum for that devastating charge that has broken 1,000 enemy lines. His 40 pounds of plate armor transforms him into a human cannonball, every piece of steel carefully articulated to allow fluid movement while deflecting any blow. But the samurai isn't standing still. He's already moving, his lighter mount dancing sideways as he draws his yumi bow. Samurai via master archers first, swordsman second. At full gallop, he could place arrows with surgical precision, targeting the narrow vision slits in his opponent's helm or the gaps where arm meets shoulder. The knight's armor might turn aside most shots, but it only takes one arrow finding its mark to end everything. Now imagine the same encounter in a bamboo forest, where the knight's lance becomes useless and his heavy armor a liability. The samurai flows between the trees like smoke, using the terrain to negate every advantage his opponent possesses. Here, the fight becomes a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the more agile warrior holding every card. The weapons themselves tell fascinating stories of their respective cultures. A knight's sword wasn't just a cutting tool, it was a lever designed to transfer maximum force through armor. The pommel could crush skulls, the crossguard could hook and trap enemy weapons, and the blade itself was built to withstand impacts that would shatter lesser weapons. These weren't elegant dueling swords. They were battlefield tools designed for one purpose: ending lives quickly and efficiently. Medieval knights developed techniques specifically for armored combat. Half-swording, where the knight gripped his blade with one hand while controlling the hilt with the other, allowed for precise thrusts aimed at armor joints. The mordschlag, or murder stroke, involved flipping the sword and using the heavy crossguard and pommel as a war hammer. These weren't desperate measures, they were refined techniques practiced for years. The samurai's katana required a completely different mindset. Every cut was a meditation on perfect form. The edge, harder than European steel but backed by a softer, more flexible spine, could achieve cuts impossible with Western swords. Samurai developed test-cutting techniques called tamashigiri, slicing through rolled straw mats, bamboo poles, and yes, sometimes human bodies to perfect their technique. But the katana wasn't their only weapon. The wakizashi, the shorter companion sword, was specifically designed for close-quarters fighting, where the longer katana became unwieldy. Together, these paired swords gave the samurai options in any combat situation. The tanto dagger provided a final option for both combat and ritual suicide, while the naginata polearm allowed them to fight effectively against mounted opponents. Here's where the analysis becomes truly complex. Different periods would produce vastly different outcomes. A 12th century knight in mail armor might find himself vulnerable to a katana's cutting power, while a 15th century knight in full plate would be nearly immune to sword cuts entirely. Similarly, an early Heian period samurai fought very differently than a battle-hardened veteran of the Sengoku Wars. The evolution of both warrior classes reveals crucial insights. Knights adapted to gunpowder weapons by developing specialized armor and tactics. Some embraced firearms themselves, becoming mounted pistoliers who combined traditional cavalry shot with ranged firepower. Others doubled down on armor thickness, creating suits so heavy they required cranes to mount their wearers on horseback. Samurai proved even more adaptable. By the late 16th century, they had integrated firearms so thoroughly into their tactical doctrine that samurai armies could field more guns than contemporary European forces. Oda Nobunaga revolutionized Japanese warfare by teaching his troops volley fire techniques, where rotating lines of gunners maintained continuous fire on enemy formations. The psychological aspect cannot be ignored. Knights fought for feudal lords, personal honor, and the promise of earthly rewards. Their battle cries were meant to intimidate, their armor designed to project invincibility. They sought decisive victory through overwhelming force, believing that superior equipment and training would carry the day. Samurai carried a different burden entirely. They fought with the knowledge that death in battle was preferable to dishonor. This wasn't mere bravado. It was a deeply ingrained philosophical position that affected every decision they made. A samurai might choose to die rather than retreat, not from stubbornness, but from a genuine belief that honor transcended survival. This mental framework created warriors who fought with terrifying intensity. European accounts of encounters with Japanese fighters consistently mention their apparent fearlessness and willingness to continue fighting despite horrific wounds. They treated pain as an obstacle to overcome through mental discipline rather than a signal to withdraw. The technical aspects of their fighting styles reveal even deeper differences. Knights trained in systems like the German school of Johannes Lichtenauer or the Italian traditions of Fiore dei Liberi. These martial arts emphasized leverage, timing, and the mechanical advantages provided by their weapons and armor. Every technique was designed to exploit physics in their favor. Japanese martial arts developed along entirely different lines. Schools like Katori Shinto Ryu and Kashima Shinto Ryu taught principles that transcended mere technique. Students learned to read opponents' intentions, to move without conscious thought, to achieve a state of mental clarity called mushin, where action flowed without hesitation or doubt. But theoretical knowledge means nothing without practical application. Historical records provide glimpses of what happened when these warrior cultures actually collided. Portuguese traders and missionaries in 16th century Japan left accounts of samurai examining European armor and weapons. They were impressed by the protection offered by plate armor, but noted its weight and inflexibility as significant weaknesses. Similarly, European accounts of Japanese fighting methods consistently praised their skill while noting tactical differences. Japanese cavalry fought primarily as mounted archers rather than shock troops, using their mobility to harass enemies rather than break lines through direct assault. This created tactical problems for European-trained minds accustomed to more direct approaches. The answer to our question shifts like sand depending on circumstances, but patterns emerge from the analysis. In open terrain with room to maneuver, the knight's advantages become overwhelming. His armor provides near-total protection, while his lance and warhorse create devastating offensive potential. The samurai's speed and skill matter little against an opponent who can absorb his attacks and respond with bone-crushing force, but confine the same fight to broken ground, inside a building, or any space where the knight cannot leverage his mobility, and the advantage swings dramatically. Here, the samurai's superior agility and refined technique begin to tell. He can target armor joints, use his opponent's weight against him, and gradually wear down a more heavily equipped but less mobile foe. The weapon matchup tells its own story. A katana simply cannot penetrate quality plate armor through direct cuts, but it doesn't need to. Samurai trained specifically to exploit gaps and weak points in armor, using precise thrusts rather than powerful cuts when faced with heavily protected opponents. Meanwhile, the knight's sword, designed for armored combat, could potentially damage the samurai's lighter protection through sheer impact force. Yet even this analysis oversimplifies the reality these warriors would have faced. Neither fought alone in actual combat. Knights charged in formation, using coordinated attacks to overwhelm enemy positions. Samurai fought as part of larger tactical units, using combined arms approaches that integrated archery, polearms, and swordwork into seamless battlefield systems. The individual duel, romantic as it seems, represents only one small facet of medieval warfare. Both cultures produced warriors designed to function within larger military machines, and removing them from that context changes everything about how they would fight and what advantages they could exploit. So after examining every angle, every weapon, every tactical consideration, what's the verdict? The truth is both more complex and simpler than you might expect. In a straight fight between a knight in full plate and a samurai with traditional gear, the outcome hinges entirely on the battlefield itself. Open ground favors the knight's devastating charge and impenetrable armor. Confined spaces give the edge to the samurai's speed and precision. But here's the real revelation. Both warriors were products of their time, shaped by the enemies they faced and the technologies they wielded. The knight's plate armor evolved to stop crossbow bolts and sword thrusts. The samurai's techniques developed to exploit gaps in Japanese armor designs. Neither was designed with the other in mind. What makes this question so compelling isn't the answer. It's what the question reveals about human ingenuity in warfare. Two completely isolated cultures, facing similar challenges of mounted combat and personal protection, developed radically different solutions. The knight became an unstoppable force. The samurai became an immovable object meeting that force with perfect timing. In the end, both warriors represent the pinnacle of their respective martial traditions. Both deserve our respect, not for who would win in some imaginary duel, but for the dedication, skill, and courage they brought to the bloodiest profession in human history. The real victory belongs to us, living in an age where we can study these warriors as history rather than face them on the battlefield.